Oh, someone wrote me and suggested that all of this might go better if in my reading of my presentation that I made it sound a bit more personal and folksy. So, well, I thought, all right. So I'll start tonight. Regarding like this first item, I'll just give you a little. I wrote this to try and initiate the healing process after my last girlfriend left me and wrecked my pickup truck. And plus she had no sympathy at all for the childhood traumas that had been affecting all my interpersonal relationships all these many years. So, as regards trying to do something extraordinary with that elusive, unstable, floating activity singular to man and apparently centered in the head, known variously as the enlightenment, the awakening, the liberation, etc., there turns out to be two main ways people generally attempt to approach it. They either try to think about it, or else they try to think about it a lot. Manufacturers caution, whenever one who knows speaks of things as being divided into twos, be advised that he is speaking symbolically of a much more complex reality. Conversation, first voice. Ever since man began to talk, the main thing he's talked about has been himself. Second voice, does that include those more conscious? First voice, no. Then there was a pause. Then the second voice added, I was about to ask if then everything we hear of a personal nature about mystics is spurious, but I guess you already answered that. Plus, who should care? Enry, the history of man on this planet. The true history of man is yet to be written, and never will be so by the ordinary. A certain artist once wondered, which is the most important, my paintings or its frame? And the answer is always the same. It's the question of talent. Over in another solar system is a gigantic machine hidden behind their sun, which secretly fuels the mental life of the thinking creatures living therein. It's possible that I could tell you something similar regarding life in this one, but something is stopping me. Well, not exactly stopping me, more like severely threatening. By the way, if you think human simpletons are easily offended, there's another certain entity real close by whose reactions in that regard make the mortal variety pale in comparisons. Not naming any names, mind you. One man looked deep down into himself and thought, why does my brain talk to me but not my liver or lungs? And even though they might know the answer, his liver and lungs didn't answer. And his brain said, kind of gives you something to think about, don't it? Children are often told that nobody likes a smart aleck, which only has any potential influence before they become familiar with their own mind. It is impossible to study the enlightening process without studying it through a system. And it is impossible to study a system without confusing it with the process. Do-da, do-da. The high water mark in most men's lives actually is 4 in number. The first is when the mind fires up and one becomes conscious. The second is puberty, when hormones kick in and one becomes sexual. The third is maturity, when both mind and hormones have reached their peak and one begins the gradual descent to death. And the fourth, of course, is death itself. A certain anesthesiast once mused, compared to the ordinary, is the natural EEG of one more conscious a flat line? After momentarily forgetting the sing-along words to their game of hopscotch, 2 kids instead used this conversation. Said the first, what's the difference between a mystic and a philosopher? And the second kid replied, a mystic don't need no books. So the first kid asked, then what's the difference between a mystic and a priest or shaman? And the second kid answered, a mystic don't need no relics or talismans. And the first kid asked, and what's the difference between a mystic and a king? And the second kid replied, a mystic don't need no subjects. And the first kid asked, so what's the difference between a mystic and a warrior? And the second kid replied, a mystic don't need no bullets. And the first kid asked, then what's the difference between a mystic and everyone else I didn't ask about? And the second kid replied, same as I already answered, nothing. There is no real difference, only that which is illusionary and can be talked about. One day one man pondered, if I didn't have a mind, how'd I talk to myself? And a dog laying nearby punched itself and said, did you hear that? One man finally arrived at this position. If everything in life is a metaphor for the drive for greater consciousness, then what is there possibly left to talk about, under the guise of it being of any specific significance? And after a brief silence, his friend added, I was about to note that being the case, then everything ever said by mystics must never be taken at a face value, but I guess that's already self-evident from your comment. One man concluded that the real challenge to the mind is to be able to study something without being critical of it. And this could not be more correct than as regards the study of the mind. A certain actor once pondered, why is tragedy so much easier than comedy? Anyone can feel the call of the mystical when they're sick. Surveying the literature and realm of the childish mind, one young lad one day paused to ponder. Are all of our dreams of superheroes but reflections of the future potential of everyday man himself? And after a bit more rumination, returned with, and is this also the basis of history making of past everyday men larger-than-life heroic figures? He then turned himself to pursuing this whole subject as regards how more specifically his own thinking dreamed of him. As when any particular physical exercise begins to hurt, you alter the way you're doing it, so too when your mental activity is not bothering you, alter it to do so. Just released statistics reveal that well over 90% of all mystics who persevere in their effort past middle age do so based on their yet held belief that something most spooky and mysterious still lies ahead. And a man, upon hearing this, pondered it for a moment, then said, I was tempted to comment that if this be correct, then it would account for certain temporal anomalies visible in the lives of those who pressed on with motivation other than the one noted. But I guess, to what end? According to a certain tale, there are intellectually active beings on one world whose conscious sense of self is not confined to their head. And a nearby star nudged itself in the ribs and said, did you hear that? Yeah. First guy says, it sure is disheartening to be ordinary. And the second guy says, yeah, but not half as much as being ordinary and acceptive of it. And if you're right, who can I write to at your show to tell you that I'm not going to watch you anymore? A tip regarding the clothing of the neural. If indeed you are coming apart, it will be at the seams. No. Note, this is not merely a warning for the routinely fashion conscious or your everyday seamstress, but potentially useful information for those engaged in, shall we say, other kinds of construction activities, in that it points specifically where to look when things appear intent on decomposing and disintegrating. Everyone has a weak spot. Regarding the body, it's in the genes. Regarding the mind, well, no one really wants to get into this. A viewer writes, okay then, if fake mystics take illness as a metaphor for life, what would real ones use? Why not put the matter of useless, distracting self-reference in a simple context? If you're not thinking about greater awareness, you're thinking about you. As he looked down at the plot before him, a man thought, a true friend is loved as much in death as he was alive. He wiped an eye, then looking upward, further thought, I'm glad I can't say the same for my original mind. If everyone alive and conscious are like hurricanes without a stable eye, then the more conscious are like hurricanes that are made up mostly of an eye. and of your rights. Not only do I dislike metaphors and symbolism in general, but I specifically despise any which tend to make me feel personally inferior. P.S. I just thought, is it possible to have a meaningful allegory that doesn't produce such a first sensation? Yours, etc. You can make your stomach warm by eating spicy food. There is also a consumption possible that will heat up the head. Written on the wall of the handball court at a certain mountain monastery. The great thing about being a young mystic rather than an old one is that a young one doesn't know any better. Beneath it, by the way, you could see where more than one old and young mystic had started to add their own comment, but seemed to think better of it in mid-sentence and left them all unfinished. All you need to know about the literary. There is one book that will tell you everything you need to know. Life. And it is printed in one particular place. Your genes. And it is readable by one specific function. Increased consciousness. A man wrote our complaint department saying that while attempting to expand his consciousness, he made his liver explode. And I don't think I want to go into or ask him exactly what kind of methods he was employing. Your muse for a Monday. Is the secret something you actually discover or something you sort of merge with? The ruler of one kingdom announced that he wanted to find the most conscious man in the land, but he wouldn't come forward and identify himself. The speaker so spoke. A man with too much to say is like a rifleman with too many bullets. And a voice in the crowd countered, but how can a rifleman, whose job it is to shoot, have too many bullets? To which the speaker retorted, it's all a question of what he's shooting at. And the voice in the crowd said, and I suppose that applies to both of the men you mentioned. And the speaker said, I suppose. Those who believe that their personal history is of any personal pertinence vis-a-vis the attempt at transformation and regeneration will surely never know. And if you're right, sometimes what you say is far too unclear, while at other times it is far too clear. As of yet, I remain uncertain as to which of the two I prefer sincerely. Men who deep down realize full well that they're never going to be any more conscious than they are right now are given as compensation the ability to enjoy worry and mental suffering. I tell you again, anyone who thinks that life is not fair has simply never seen a seesaw from afar. See, to be able to do so is a higher state of consciousness. When it comes to talking about the mystical, there are two available approaches. One is to talk about it directly, and the other is to talk about everyday life, extracting pertinent examples therefrom. And since the first is not possible, what are you going to do? I just did. A man wrote the Midway Doctor and asked, Dear Doctor, are the operations of the normal human mind more like a merry-go-round, a roller coaster, or a test-your-strength machine? And the doctor replied, you left out the guess-your-age booth. Whenever man just about had this one mythical beast figured out, it changed into an entirely new creature. Whenever man just about had this one mystical system well in hand, it turned into something freshly ungraspable. There's a real good reason that no one really likes real mysticism except real mystics. And even they are loath to let on. Just as those on board began to sing, sailing, sailing over the bounding main, the waters became their voice and the silence of reality swallowed itself. Well, like I said, it's no wonder this kind of stuff is so gosh darn popular. Now, if we could only get a blind man to see, a deaf man to hear, a lame man to walk, and everybody else, well, we might really be on to something. Right. A man wrote to the, I'll try not to be too discouraging if you'll close a little something extra for me in your letter, doctor. And ask, "Dear doctor, will knowing the secret keep you from getting sick?" But the doctor had to ask the man whether he meant physically or otherwise. The visible history of mysticism is the invisible history of genes made visible. Another way by which you can be certain that you're still reasonably ordinary is if you can listen to what the majority of your fellow men talk about as being important without either giggling or grimacing. In all your major cities, it is prohibited for the collective to be foolish. There is a good reason the more conscious are always in the minority, and it has nothing to do with their number. Life told one guy, "Look, if the sun gets too bright, all you got to do is whine." A man wrote the "Now you see him, now you don't" doctor and asked, "Dear doctor, if someone becomes conscious enough, do they disappear?" And the doctor had to ask if the writer meant physically or otherwise. Query, why would one go to all the effort to travel from Paris to Istanbul and then get off the train with the out that were there when they started the trip? Life told another guy, "Look, when it all gets to be too much, all you got to do is blink." As per a certain legend, there was once one mystical school that should you get inside the front door, you'd be immediately faced with a large sign that announced, "We do not talk about the mystical in here," which allegedly was a would-be student's first test, and if he passed, his final one as well. People from other worlds have different blood, as do those from other time zones. So how come you still got that old kind? A man with no plans or preparations at all, at least, has a dog's chance. The power of myths men say they feel is only sustainable as long as you can't see behind them. As the real Lao arose in the morning, he said to his shadow version, "Make up the bed when you get up." Yeah. The mystery of the mystical is at night. Its reality in the daytime. In response to other letters that I've been receiving for years, specifically ask, that is, the writer specifically will ask about some particular so-called mystical system, some guru, some group that they are attempting to follow, or they say in which they have an interest. And the gist of the letter, at least at the end, is to ask my opinion, which is not what they should be doing. Because what they should be concerned with, if I was going to actually respond in any manner resembling their question, would be to point out to them that they should not be soliciting mine or anyone else's opinion. They should be asking themselves, what do they understand of what they are attempting to pursue? So since such communiques continue, might as well get specific for a time being and just mention what has historically and contemporaneously still constitute the apparent, the so-called, the self-proclaimed mystical activities. And the general categories, general divisions are simply, they track the general functional, speaking verbally, divisions of man. Just the general areas that constitute an ordinary man's life still fairly faithfully track the general categories of attempted mystical transforming disciplines. Some of these the names change, they shift throughout the years, and sometimes now they overlap. But they're not that hard to identify. They're not that hard to specify within a very limited number. The most common in the West would be referred to as yoga, that you're dealing with the body. And in the West, there's no sense, no profit in trying to get into any linguistic history lesson, but in the West, yoga means a bit more specifically, connotatively, operationally than it did originally. But in the West, when you hear the term yoga, you know that people are referring to exercises. They're referring to attempted work on the body. You have areas that people would refer to as spiritual, and often that will be involved with their attempt to do good deeds in life, their attempt to undertake some continuing regimen of charitable activities. And oftentimes this is one of the places that can overlap into the third area I was going to mention, but oftentimes this kind of attempted spirituality will include prayer. But prayer can be of two different types. It can be more of a mental process than it is an intellectual thrust. But in this second division I'm right now including what would be more an emotional approach. The people believe that to transform themselves in some way, whatever they're calling it, and generally they're not being as specific as I normally am to say that what you're attempting to transform is that one singular elusive activity that seems to be centered in one's head, consciousness, mental awareness. I'm fully aware, as you are, that in many other contexts they use different terms, and when they, in the area that's normally thought of as being spiritual, they certainly do not use it on the basis of anything having to do with the head specifically. They believe that there is some spark of divinity or that there is some indefinable spiritual part of man. But what they're dealing with is by and large the emotional side of man. And the charitable works, as I said, oftentimes will include or overlap with some sort of prayer, but the prayer is used for a purpose that can be distinguished from the third group I was going to point out, when it's an attempt to, in some way, to reel in the ramblings of the mind. But when it's done for those that would normally call themselves spiritual, or any activity that seems to be of a, by anyone's definition, that seems to be of a spiritual nature, then any time that prayer is used, it is normally an attempt, without them understanding it, to try and reel in the emotions, the uncivil, the instinctive side of man. That when you're dealing with the second type, as I'm describing, that would be all forms of so-called religious mysticism, whether it be under the umbrella of Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, any term they want. They are separating it, whether they do not have to necessarily deny that there might be any benefit in exercise or to work on one's body, but they would consider the thrust that any ordinarily recognized, identifiable, so-called mystical school is going to have the major thrust of either working on one's body or attempting to work on the emotions in some way. And then the third, of course, is sort of a hit or miss affair, that you're trying to do something with the mind, with attention. But in the second case, they are not attempting to reel in the mind and attention. They feel like that it is their approach is that it's the uncivil, the non-spiritual, the ungodly-like, the unhumane areas of human emotion, which, for the sake of all you interested in statistics, constitute somewhere within a spitting distance of 100% of all human emotions. But it's to reel in the untoward emotions. And they do not normally range that far away, but they're normally based upon what else? Sex. the desire to hoard up possessions, which is the drive to survive with a bit of planning thrown in. But it is seen from their view. It is seen from their view, since you've got to have a system with an ordinary person to get them started. It is simply on the basis, no matter how they state the premise, but the basis is that, well, as all the systems are, that something is lacking in man. But in the spiritual, in that second approach, it's normally on the basis that the premise states one way or the other that all of us are pretty rotten, that man is just, he's flawed, no matter which story of creation you take, or no matter which historical approach or mythical approach that seems to have led them there. They simply announce, well, no, we all know, if you showed up here at our introductory lecture, they say, first off, let's understand, we're just all no good. I mean, none of us are perfect. None of us measure up to whatever standard they're using, Buddhist, Christ-like, whatever it is, or just a humanistic standard. None of us measure up. And everybody goes, yeah. So from there, the approach is, then they say, well, so what we've got to do is try and measure up and perfect ourselves. And everybody goes, okay. And they say, but the main thing that is keeping us from perfection, from some increased development, is our human emotions. And if they were doing it in a Western Christian or Judaic sense, would be to point back, here it is, original sin, look what got Adam in trouble. It was his emotions. It wasn't his body. God didn't look down at him and say, boy, are you overweight. Get the hell out of here. Or, boy, is your nose big. Boy, are you ugly. No. Plus, he didn't turn around and say, boy, are you stupid. Or he didn't say, hey, you're getting too sharp for your own good. It was all on the basis of your emotions unreliable. They got you in trouble. And you can take, or they do take, the story of Adam's temptation. Is you can take at least two nice versions, which cover 2/3 of the need to keep for man to survive, that either he was tempted by sex or simply by greed, by hunger. It's all the same thing. That is, that the very things that make man, that make any creature survive, are looked at from that view as being the very things against which we must struggle for some greater purpose. It's hard to beat it. Well, you never have anything to do. It has certain inherent advantages over the yoga type, or trying to work on one's body, because if you fell into a group that says, well, the main thing holding men back from some increased personal process of evolution is our poor physical state. And of course, most of the time, you can get people just as easily with that as saying, well, we're all no good. All you got to do is call the 6 billion people on this planet together under whatever guise and holler, by the way, before we start tonight, we're going to have free beer and hot dogs and stuff. But before we do that, could I ask, do we all agree that most of us are we're all pretty badly flawed. Am I right? And anybody that doesn't raise their hand out of the 6 billion, you give my advice, get away from them. Because they're Fruit Loops. They're dangerous. Because any sane person, they're going to go, yeah. But by the same token, what I want you to understand is according to what they're wired up to want to find, you could take the first group and you can tell them, hey, you know what's holding us back? You know what man's main flaw is? His poor physical condition. Am I right or am I wrong? And out of the 6 billion people that would show up, or 50 people that show up for an introductory lecture to something, you do understand. Almost all people will go, well, that's true. And the speaker says, are we all in primo physical condition? Huh? Are we? If you are, raise your hand. And conversely, in this case, if anybody raised their hand, if I were you, I would move my chair if you're close to them. Because no matter what they say, no matter what you think, well, I'm in better shape than I was, you're still flawed. But see, the thing is, if they decided, if their approach was, we must all lose 50 pounds, we must all lose 10 pounds, whatever it is, you can do that. And then they have to up the stakes, have to come up with something else. It's like the continuing building fund with churches or any organization. That we would all be much better, we would all be more conscious, we'd be all, if it was Christian. We'd all be closer to some Christ consciousness if, by God, we had that new assembly hall over here. And all we need is another $2 million, and we're working on it, and they got charts and all, and it seems like we get more and more money, and that we get closer to getting the thing built. And you sit there, and you'll end up taking it as some sort of spiritual progress. It's better than nothing, but once it gets built, you know what happens. They throw one big party, and the next week, they realize we're going to have to put a second story on this place. So the point is, you didn't lose your place. No, you didn't. The advantage that the spiritual approach has over the physical is the physical can say, they can say, well, here's the way you begin our particular approach. That they call it some yoga school, let's say. And they said, our approach is everyone needs to lose 10 pounds. Everyone has got to give up all red meat. And everyone must eat no more than 500 calories a day. The point is, you can do that, but to say we must all overcome our baser human instincts, you can't do it. I'm just trying to point out to you why some religions are much more popular than others. I mean, there's not even any comparison. Because in the first instance, you lose 50 pounds, or 10 pounds where it was. You give up all salt and red meat, and you begin to live on 500 calories a day, and then you go back to the head guy and you go, well, I've done it. He goes, really? Okay, he's going to be, but if you say, yeah, and you go, so far so good. Now what? Then he's got to say, all right, I'm going to have to meditate on your case, and he's got to go away and think, now what I tend to do. But when you're dealing on the basis of the second kind of group, that you've got to struggle against human emotion, they don't have to worry about what's the next stage. Nobody's going to come to them and say, well, I have overcome all desire for greed. I've overcome all lust. Well, unless the guy's maybe 80 years old. Then they don't want you much as a follower anyway because you're probably broke. Well, you got no enthusiasm. They put you in charge of making the coffee or cleaning up. All you want's a place to hang around. But the thing is, if the second group says, well, what we must do first, our first steps, what we've got to do is you have got to overcome all sexual thoughts, let's say. You've got to come up that and all greedy thoughts. And I can make up many more, as you know. You've got to overcome all aggressive imagination. You've got to overcome all critical thinking about others. I mean, is that plain enough? People go, yeah, you're right. Assuming that you're the sort to be attracted to the second group of people, that you didn't like the first thing. The second one says, what is holding men back, what must be dealt with is their uncontrollable emotions. And you go, well, that sounds better. The first one, you just didn't like it. You wasn't interested in losing weight or whatever the excuse was. You didn't think, well, that's not the way you go about some sort of metaphysical development, is through working on the body. Shit, if I'd go join ballets. I'd take up weightlifting or something. So you end up with the second group, and they say, no, the body's important. We must, we should stay healthy and all that. But that's not what's holding men back. It's their out of control emotions. And you go, yeah, now, this is it. Where do I sign up? Tell me what to do. And they say, all right. Now remember, this group I was just trying to get to see as opposed to the first group. So you've got to lose 50 pounds, give up red meat, and live on 500 calories a day. You can do that. You can actually do that. If you start off and you take the word of someone that you submit to the system, you say, well, I'll try it and see what happens. You try it, and any effort you make after that you lost the weight, got the meat and that Saturday, you'd feel better for a time being. And so you go back and you go, I like that. Now what? And then they got to deal with, you mean you did it? And then they got to think of something new. I'm just showing there is an inbred advantage to the second approach, the second group's activities throughout the ages, is that there's no chance of success. I mean, none. Well, unless you want to die. They might as well tell you, well, here's what we should do. Stop breathing. Yeah. That's the closest you're going to come to succeeding at being a Christian, a Jew, a Buddhist, anything at the normal level as religion is translated by the mass, by the collective thinking of man. So you're dealing with something that cannot be done. But the approach, well, let me hit the other one so that I want to get in for a few minutes specifically about what they're doing with their various methods, which all come down to basically the same thing. Then there are those groups, smaller in number, and all of this, if you would like to see it in one way, it, in a sense, tracks the history of man, the development of man up my nervous system when I draw it. If you want to look at linearly the history of man, that the first group would be the yogas. And the first group still goes on the same way that we have Eastern Standard Time is still extant, even though Pacific Standard Time is also running right along right this second, even as we speak. And so there are people still living in the Eastern Time Zone, and there are people living in the Pacific Time Zone. And there are people living at the physical level, by and large. So if you looked at it, you would see the biggest, like a snake that swallowed several objects. You'd see the bowling ball down at the tail end. That's the furthest back. That's the physical approach. Then the middle would be, I guess he swallowed a softball. And that would be where you'd find the people. This is not actually fit, by the way, because it shifted, but now I started. Well, the softball would be those working on the emotions. But the way it turns out, they got confused and people think they're doing one thing, they're not the other. But at any rate, you got toward the head of the snake, and if you look real big, he might have swallowed, I don't know, maybe a BB. The point is, relative to the kinds of activity going on, even ostensibly, even the attempt specifically to work on the mind is small, very small in comparison to those involved with activities dealing with the emotions and those dealing with the body. But they always have been, and there still remain those that attempt to deal with the mind. Probably the best known, these is to describe, best known to people would be what is now referred to as Zen, or some of the more ancient forms of Tibetan Buddhism, which is an attempt, and certain aspects of Sufism as it's analyzed in the West, as it's called. It's the attempt to take the mind and to reel it in, to bring it under control. In a sense, to give a comparison, that they are attempting to do with the mind what religious people are attempting to do with the emotions. Well, now that I've done that, let me take the approaches, the kind of methods. And the methods appear to be quite dissimilar amongst the three groups, but within each group there are methods that appear to be dissimilar, and they're not. And even at the larger level, the similarity between the three major groups are not as dissimilar as might at first seem. Well, let's take the body. And the body includes all forms of attempt to work on health. And the easiest being, everyone has a picture. If you mention yoga in the West, people imagine doing the postures. It has an effect, not on everybody. You got to always remember this: there is no system in any of the categories. There's only that which seems to satisfy some people. And so to say that yoga has a certain effect, there are people that you could get to do the yoga postures, and they'd do it, and could do it. I don't mean people that are in some way infirm. Somebody come in, you say, you ever heard of yoga? Yeah, well, you got them interested and say, and let's say that we had an expert to teach it, and they said, well, do this. And the person will say, well, is there some reason? And they tried to give an idea, well, this is going to help. It will soothe you. It will calm your emotions. It can help focus your mind. Just try it, and you'll really enjoy it. Now, again, I'm speaking of someone in fine physical condition, that you get them to do it, and they try it, and they try it, and I mean more than once. They try it a few times, and they go, it's nothing. So remember, we're not talking about, you've got still in every case, including that which seems to be matters extraordinaire, you still cannot have one person doing a tango. And you cannot have one person leading a herd when there is no herd. And so it's not a matter of whether yoga or prayer or anything works. It's a matter at the ordinary level, does it seem to work with you? So what I'm saying is, just doing the postures, just doing the hatha yoga, the physical side of yoga, does not necessarily show any promise or offer any, or seem to offer any benefit to everybody. But there are people, if it does, it does. And if it don't, it don't. So it's not that there's magic in the postures. So remember that. But back to the general approach. they're working on the body. No matter how it's described, it is that by specifically working on the body, other benefits will accrue of a wider nature. That if, and I'm just taking the most basic, straightforward descriptions that I can give, and I'm attempting to do no one a disservice, to go ahead and speak on the behalf of, from a Western view. I'm talking about the United States circa 21st century. That they would describe yoga as saying, well, it will do so much good for the body that it will have other effects if you continue to pursue it. In line with yoga would be other forms that might be included in yoga, but there are even people now, nothing new, but there are people now who attempt to take a kind of nutritionalist approach, and there's probably some sort of new age occult type based term for some kind of person who uses diet in that they would think, or they claim, a truly transcendental manner. But be that as it may, you all know that there are many people around who spend a great deal of attention on their health, that health is their hobby. And I mean now in a mystical, would-be mystical sense, not just ordinary hypochondriactors. For those of you in the psychiatric building trades, the poor gentleman who coined that term for me. I don't mean just people who are professional hypochondriacs. I mean people who believe that they're indeed engaged with attempting to expand themselves in some way, to transform themselves spiritually, that they spend a great deal of time giving attention to the diet, which all of this, if you can begin to see the connection I was about to point out again, is a very safe, a historically sound approach to trying to do something, because there's no end to it and it will not do you any harm. I mean, if you're sane. I'm not saying people will end up trying to live off of tree bark. But I'm saying just to have health is just a general hobby that if you found someone they taught perhaps in conjunction with doing the yoga posture, that not only that they'd say, because after a while if they just said that there are 15 major ones we do that you must do and it take you some time, you got to where you could do it, then they insist, well, it's got to be done by sunrise of each day, and it must be done without fail. It must be done. In other words, it's a challenge. It requires nothing else, a challenge logistically to play around, be able to do it, and then after X amount of months or years, you can say, well, I do it. I can do it now. I can do all the postures. I can do it the prescribed length of time. I can do it. I can get up now. I used to sleep late. I can get up now. As soon as the sun comes up without an alarm clock, I can do it all. And they said, now what we need to do is tie in your diet, because the body is a fractal of God Himself. That it is a reflection. The body is a reflection of the divine spark, etc. So now we must begin to take strict attention to diet. The point is, again, assuming you're sane and don't do yourself harm, you can play with diet from now until the day you die. It's a very cheap hobby. Best of my knowledge, it's cheaper than philatelism. Cheaper than collecting 2x4s or antique cars. It's cheap. You just sit around, whatever's the latest thing about, well, more salt, less salt, more calcium, less calcium, high fat, low fat, how's your cholesterol, how's your Uncle Charlie. You can play with diet and sit there and it will get you nowhere, do you no harm, again, if you're sane. But they use it as a part of an approach, supposedly, to some transformation of man. And at that level, if you're satisfied, it makes quite reasonable sense. The hallmark, or the rallying cry always being, we are what we eat. And somebody tell you that, and if you're at the level to be pursuing one of these systems anyway, that makes as much sense as anything, probably a little more. They say, well, you're taking care of your body now, you do the postures, and you've lost a little weight, but now we've got to be concerned about what you put in your body. Because whatever you put in there, that's what you are. We got to all kinds of crackpot schemes throughout history about we got to balance it between all kinds of this and that. It becomes that health is a hobby. That is, health becomes a metaphysical hobby, but that's all it is a hobby. It gets you no further insofar as transforming man himself than does simply learning to do every possible known yoga posture. or any more than if you were a different type, that you decide that running could be a mystical experience. And if you'd been a couch broccoli for all these years, for all of you cliche haters, a couch pudding, and somebody got you under the guise of trying to increase your consciousness to go out and take up running, then if you did do it and you were the sort to be wired up to do it, by the time you had gone from not being able to walk 50 feet without having to ask for oxygen to get to the point of running 2 miles a day, you'd feel so good you might continue to go, well, if I feel this good, if I could run 4 a day, I'd feel twice that good, and you could keep on and on and on, until your knees blew out. It's sort of like diet, as you can use that as a kind of hobby, and it's certainly not doing you any harm, unless you have some particular fondness for your knees, or secondarily perhaps your shins. But it is like a non-ending, inexpensive, harmless cul-de-sac. But all of it, they say, is the attempt to bring the body into some sort of particular alignment. That is, that each man physically is not as he should be, and that critique again is indefensible. Because no sane person can say, I'm in perfect health. Not only perfect health, organically speaking, to say that I'm in perfect condition. I do not have 1 ounce of extraordinary fat, extraneous extra fat. My muscle tone is exactly as it should be. No one can say that. And so you're open to the criticism. There's no way that a sane person can go, well, this is not for me, or that there cannot be any validity to such an approach because I am already a perfect human specimen in perfect health, so how come I am not enlightened? And they got you. But a person then in the second group, what I was going to get to right quick was what they're attempting to do by such things as all the known common spiritual rituals, disciplines, and activities. Attempting to do good works, to do charity. There have been numerous attempts, known attempts throughout history, and there are people, at least individuals, recognized now as being on some higher road to human evolution who are currently devoting themselves to charitable works, doing good for others, putting oneself last. They do not understand it, but it is based upon, again, attempting to submerge or subdue the running feeling of one's individuality, which is spurious to start with, because it's only ordinary people, only people with an ordinary level of understanding believe that what they are is in some way individualistic. Your body is certainly your own, but that is not what makes people assume or conceive of themselves as being an individual. You certainly can look in the mirror and recognize you from someone else, and you know whether you're overweight or whether you think your hair is too thin or whatever it is. But any ordinary sane person can, relatively speaking, discount that compared to, yeah, I may not look like much outside, but inside, whether you actually say this, your thing is inside is not necessarily what's reflected by my externals. It is internally. It is on one's internal sensation that one has a feeling of individuality, but it is indeed spurious. Anyone who pursues this activity any length of time as one of the first things that you happily must confront. Boy, am I a big deal. Boy, I really am. Well, all right, some of you will assume that some of the laughter I'm eliciting here is based upon some experience and understanding. But do note that those attempting the approach I mentioned of working on the emotions, the kind of spiritual approach at the heart of doing good works, being charitable, is tied right into the parallel theology in all the world's major religions that one should be humble. No one knows why. The explanation is just, be humble. God wants you to be humble. It says so right here in chapter 17. But what they're attempting to do without knowing it is if they knew what they were doing and pushed it far enough, the whole thing about trying to be charitable, trying to be humble, trying to put others before yourself is not to do good work. That was not the basis of it. That's the myth of it. The reality of it is that if you did that with a certain attitude, or if you did that being directed to, or if somebody suggested you do that who knew the purpose of it, and you stayed in touch with them, you might get the reality of it out. And the reality of it out is to find out that this feeling that I should be helping my fellow man, this is all an illusion. The illusion that I am me, and that my fellow man is so-and-so, that we're in some ways separate, and well, the whole feeling that I am individual in some meaningful sense. People are not. Now, certainly anyone who knows that does not go out and talk about it in public, not that would make people realize it or make people admit it, but people do have an ingrained, inherent genetic fear of that. That's why people are so frightened. All middle of the road, middle class, sane people are so adverse to at least non-moderate amounts of alcohol, almost all drugs, and if you don't get the point there, the great fear of insanity, the great fear of intellectually falling apart, the great fear that something will drive me crazy. People fear that. The more civilized you are, the more you would fear that as opposed to, say, cancer. There is something, it is inherent in man that he realizes, without knowing it, that up here, that is what he thinks of as his real personality, is on extremely. As that other great Southern philosopher, Delbert McClinton, would say, he understands I am on extremely shaky ground. And people fear it. People do not. And you can see people that, I mean, that's not hard to find. I even get communiques regarding this program and things I've written publicly. That people write and really rail against what they perceive me to be doing, that, wait, you're trying to drive me crazy. It's easy to laugh at, I guess. But it is, the more that they are part of the mainstream, where they should be in life, they do have an ingrained fear about that. It is inherent in man that, wait a minute, I might take a risk, I might smoke, maybe I shouldn't, and I might drink some, and maybe I shouldn't. But, I don't fool, I grew up, whatever they were, I grew up, my father, my family, they were Southern Baptists, they voted Democratic. I always mind my business. I try to do that. I do not go out taking up with strange religions or strange philosophies or strange anything, political ideas. That kind of stuff. I can listen to people. I know how it is. You can't trust people out there. You can show up at some rally, and first thing you know, it sounds like they're trying to get you involved with some new Tupperware sales scheme. And first thing you know, they're trying to convert you to be a communist or something. That kind of stuff, they can do it to you. It's the conspiracy idea. That people can trick you, people can screw around with your mind. Again, I was giving you credit that the humor that comes from it is to think about people. Now, I'm doing two things at once. They're supposed to be that way. Assuming you all came from sane, ordinary families, your parents should have been more or less that way. Of course, you can never do this. Your parents were closet something else's, but even if they didn't know it. But anyway, sane people, quite ordinary people go, now look, there's some things we should not be screwing around with our minds and our thought process. Assuming we start off, says an ordinary person, and I'm pretty sane and stable, and I'm not a weirdo, I'm not a fanatic of some kind, I'm a Southern Baptist, or I'm a Wisconsin Lutheran. Whatever they are, they go, I believe in that, and it did my father well, all my neighbors that way. I don't need to hear this weird stuff. It's just, it's kind of dangerous. But think about it. Now, I stated that's the way they're supposed to be, but the little sort of joke, I guess you could say, between you and I was that you laugh, and in one sense, you can do it without any hostility toward the mainstream of life, is the unrecognized indigenous humor to people, quite ordinary people, educated people, successful people, they go, wait a minute, I don't like people screwing around my mind because that can get dangerous. In other words, they're saying I could be driven crazy, so I got to watch it. I could lose my mind. The question, of course, I'll go ahead and do it for you, is, well, sir, what kind of mind did you have to start with? You're going to hear something and your mind suddenly disintegrates? I'll have no part of it. At any rate, it's very often, running out of time, so I don't have the space to go into great detail, but it has been very widely used throughout history of people attempting to devote their efforts and their apparent attention to other people. That's what I mean when I say, to try and do good works in life. In all of these, there is a basis for it. There is a modicum of reality. It started somewhere, but before these myths. It was produced by something, and the actual production, if you still knew how to use it, was you're trying to awaken your own awareness to the fact that this idea that what you are now is some individual that is in some way individualistically based, and that you had some part of it, and that internally, and up here is what we're talking about. We're not talking about down in here, no matter what they think. We're not talking about in some elusive heart where the spirit lies. It's right here. It is there where the person feels their individuality. It is there where they think of themselves as being I, as being Bill Greenberg, or whoever you are. And it's here that you feel most vulnerable, because you know to protect yourself from a bullet or a stab or falling rocks. But up here, this thing is super sensitive, because it does not really know from whence evil may come, danger may come. And so you must simply protect what you are now. That is what is at the ordinary level. That would fit a psychiatric definition of sanity. But at any rate, in walking around every day terminology, to be sane is to remain what you are, without them knowing it. The attempt to devote your attention, your life, taken to the extreme, to devote your life to others, to engage in charitable works. The reality of it is, if they knew what they were doing and had the intent, would be to do that for a little while. And I certainly have no time to explain it, and I'm not sure if I did, I would try much further. But it would be with the right kind of person that they could do that, and somewhere along the way, and I don't mean years, much less a lifetime, that they would begin to sense a whole new relationship, not just between them and the people they're trying to help, the homeless, the hungry throughout the world, or whatever they're doing. But they would begin to be disavowed of this certainty that their own individual personality was actually all that personal and individualistic. If there's a next time, maybe we'll go on with that, or maybe somebody write me a better letter.